Hello and welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week we are studying Matthew chapter 18 and Luke chapter 10. This is gonna be a good one. Basically we are studying some parables and some amazing parables that I'm really excited to study. And then I feel like the other category is we get a lot of stories of Jesus in different ways, teaching the people around him to focus on what actually matters the most. I love it. I love it. I'm so excited to dive into these stories about the parables and also what actually matters most. Why do we need to focus on the things that Jesus is pointing us towards? And I think he does that in a lot of different ways. Okay, looking at our reading assignment though, only 2 chapters this week, which seems very small compared to what we've had to read in previous weeks. So a great time to either really double down on these readings or find other things to read to fill your time, or just kind of refocus on what we're reading this week. Obviously, Matthew chapter 18 makes sense, but Luke, poor book of Luke. We've just been jumping around in Luke, right? We've talked about how Matthew is kind of our guidepost. We're following that one through chronologically, and then to the best of our abilities, we're getting all the other chapters in some way or another. We're hitting all of them, but just in kind of different orders. So we've already read Luke 11 and Luke 13, and now we're going back to do Luke chapter 10. We're still missing Luke 12. We will get that one soon. But it actually works out really well timeline-wise, because what had just happened in Luke chapter 9, which we read many weeks ago actually, was the Mount of Transfiguration. And that's where we just were last week. So chronologically, these chapters actually fit together perfectly, even though we've kind of been all over the place in good old Luke. Okay, let's talk about the parables that we're going to study. There are 3 parables we're going to hit on. The first one is the parable of the shepherd leaving the 99 to go find the one lost sheep. Now, I love this because the Jews really were confused why Jesus wasn't seeking after all the powerful people. He wasn't trying to find where he could get the most recognition. He was very literally eating with sinners, right? That was so confusing to them. That didn't really make sense. But what would make sense to them is a shepherd's relationship to sheep, right? If a shepherd lost one sheep, the Jews were very familiar with how that shepherd would desperately go and search until that lost sheep was found. And so I just love that Jesus meets us where we're at. He gave them exactly the parable that made sense to them, to teach them why he wasn't trying to find the most powerful, righteous people and spend all his time with them, kicking back and relaxing. He was out there searching for the lost sheep. So love this parable. Okay, the second one we're going to study is often kind of titled. A lot of these parables have titles, not that they're given in the scriptures, but more just kind of like common titles that we refer to them as, just so we all have this common language. This next one is often referred to as the parable of the ungrateful servant, which the servant starts off very grateful because it starts with a servant who works for a king, and he builds up a huge debt. In fact, it says about 10,000 talents. Now, Elder Holland quoted a source, and it's really hard, honestly, to exactly calculate how much money this would be. A lot of people try and do it, and it's just, there's way too many variables. It's hard to tell. But according to the source that Elder Holland quoted, one calculation could be that this servant had racked up a debt to the king that was more than $1 billion. $1 billion debt racked up. And this king forgives the entire debt to the servant. Forgives it all. So, of course, this servant is very grateful. He just got a huge debt forgiven. Amazing. So grateful. But then this servant goes out and he finds someone else who owes a debt to him. And this person owes a debt of about 100 pence. And if we use the same kind of calculation of 10,000 talents equaling over $1 billion, then 100 pence is about $100. And this servant then goes to the person who owes him 100 pence, $100, right? And demands that he be paid that amount of money and does not forgive the debt. Love this parable so much. So many intricate lessons about forgiveness, right? That I think we all need to learn. How much of a debt have we racked up? And yet how unwilling are we sometimes to forgive much smaller debts that we give to each other. Love it. Okay, the final parable is probably one of the most famous parables of all time that is like a common cultural reference, and that is the parable of the Good Samaritan. So excited to study about this. As a reminder, Samaritans, remember, they were descended from a group of Israelites, but then they had intermingled with a lot of other cultural groups and religious groups over the years, creating this kind of unique group of people who they thought that they were righteous and doing the right things, but they had no priesthood power, they had no access to a temple, and the Jews totally looked down on them. I mean, they weren't just like low class, they were outcasts. They weren't the lowest in their society, they were not even a part of their society. Like the Samaritans they just seemed so weird and different and beneath them. They did not even want to communicate with them. It's amazing. So as we read the story, keep that in mind. I think that's important to keep in mind. When it talks about the lawyer, it says the whole reason Jesus tells this parable is because the lawyer starts asking Jesus some questions. And I feel like I've usually pictured this as like, oh yes, a lawyer who's like arguing in court or something. Just to clarify, this lawyer would have been a scribe. They would have been a scribe, meaning they weren't necessarily like arguing legal cases. They would have been the people who were deciding religious cases. They would have been extremely familiar with the law, which is why it makes sense that Jesus starts asking this person questions back. Like he's not just like, Jesus isn't like, let me just teach you. He starts pressing him and asking the lawyer some questions, because the scribe would have been super familiar with the law and would have been able to have a conversation with Jesus about what the expectations were, and Jesus could kind of poke and prod with that. So kind of notice that as they're having this conversation. The scribe knew what he was talking about as he asks, who is our neighbor? Who are we expected to love? Jesus kind of turns the tables on him. Now, there are a few people in the parable that you'll want to know about. The first one is being a priest. A priest walks by. Now, a priest would have been a Levite, right? Only Levites were priests. And they would have been someone who officiated in the temple. That's what priests did. So this is quite literally a temple worker, a temple officiator, walking past and not helping someone. The next person who walks by is just identified as a Levite. Now, this person wouldn't necessarily have been a priest, right? Like all priests are Levites, but not all Levites are priests, right? But regardless, the Levites still would have been very familiar with Jewish law and would have known of the expectation to love the neighbor. And then, of course, we have the Samaritan, the outcast, someone who had been treated, it's hard to even say poorly. Well, I mean, absolutely poorly, but just not even treated like anything, like completely rejected, who then is doing the service. Okay, love those parables. I love them. They're amazing. Like I said, the other theme is kind of Jesus in a few different stories and instances showing people how to decide what matters most. Mostly through, he's calling his 70. He's calling and setting apart his 70 and teaching them how to focus on what matters most. And then we also get our first introduction to two individuals named Mary and Martha. We'll get to talk about them a few more times, but I'm excited to talk about this first story with Mary and Martha. Okay, let's talk specifically about what are in these chapters. So starting with Matthew chapter 18. This is the chapter where Jesus starts teaching about become as little children. It is better to cut off your hand than to offend. He's starting off with some really strong teachings here. And then he gives the parable of leaving the 90 and 9 to go find the lost sheep. He then gives his apostles the sealing power. Gives them the sealing power. And then he gives the parable of the ungrateful servant. Remember, the one who was forgiven a debt, but then didn't forgive a debt that someone else owed him. And then he kind of goes on a little bit more about forgiveness and teaches more about forgiveness, because that certainly was a lesson that tied into that pretty well. Okay, that's pretty much it for Matthew 18. Going to Luke chapter 10, this is when, remember, the Mount of Transfiguration had just happened, which is what we had studied previously in Matthew as well. We go into Jesus calling and sending out his 70. His 70. I love that we have the scriptural doctrinal basis for the 70. And yet today we also have 70 who are called and given authority. And Jesus kind of gives them their priorities. What are these 70 supposed to be doing? Jesus teaches them, right? He tells them exactly what he should be doing. Jesus then condemns some cities for rejecting the prophets. You'll see kind of a list of that. And then we get the parable of the Good Samaritan. We have the lawyer asking the question. And then Jesus starting a conversation and then launching into this parable. And then finally, we get the story of Mary and Martha. So Mary and Martha were sisters. They were also siblings to Lazarus. We don't talk about Lazarus in this chapter, but we will get to Lazarus plenty. But Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were siblings. They lived in the town of Bethany, which is just right outside of Jerusalem. And they were clearly very good friends with Jesus. I just think of them like great family friends, right? Jesus clearly loved this family, Mary and Martha and Lazarus. And so in this story that we get to read this week in Luke 10, we get an account of Jesus coming to Mary and Martha's house. And Martha is busy cleaning up and doing lots of other things, while Mary is then sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to him talk. And Martha tries to rebuke Mary and say, you're leaving me all alone here. And instead, Jesus teaches Martha the lesson that Martha needed to learn in that moment, which was that she needed to focus on what matters the most. And I think my perspective, there's lots of lessons we can take from this story. I think my perspective on this story is that exactly that. Jesus taught Martha what she needed to hear in that moment. And sometimes that's the lessons that we need to hear. Sometimes that's not the lesson that we need to hear, right? That's the great thing about having the Spirit with us, is that the Spirit, as an extension of our Savior, can give us the invitations that we personally need in that moment. Is it, hey, stop doing the dishes and come focus on what matters most? Or is there something else that needs to get done? I think there's lots of lessons we can learn. And in that moment, Martha needed to be reminded of what is the better part. What is the better part that she could choose? All right, that is it for this week. I think my personal focus question, I love Mary and Martha, so of course I'll focus on that. But I mean, the parable of the Good Samaritan, I can't let that slide by without really diving into it. And I want to think, what makes the Samaritan good? Like specifically, what are the qualities? What are the things that he did, that he said, that he actually followed through on, the qualities that he had? What made him good? And then specifically, how can I start to apply some of those qualities even more into my life? Like literally, what does it look like to become more like this good Samaritan? It's a lofty goal. I think that's a really lofty goal, but I think it's important, right? I think our prophet's most recent message kind of hits the nail on the head with that one. Like, we've got to love others. We've got to put contention behind us. We've got to reach out and love. So what does that look like for me? All right, that's what I'm going to focus on this week. Have a great week and happy studying.